All right, just a little bit about me. I am currently one of the security engineers for ProCircular, work with Zach and those guys, and then I'm one of the administrators for TryHackMe. This actually came out of a number of questions that I had with working there about how do you go about making a vulnerable virtual machine, because, well, it's not something that really most people want to do with introducing vulnerabilities into a system that's usually perfectly fine, as long as it's not a default install of Windows 7. So this is a series, almost a guide of how to go about doing that, demystifying the core components of how do you make that virtual machine happen. Then this is actually based off of a blog article that I wrote for TryHackMe. That's the original link. If you want to play along at home, you can just read the article there. But the talk version will be quite exciting. So imagine this. You've just done a virtual machine on Hack the Box, maybe something off of VulnHub, maybe something on TryHackMe, and you're thinking to yourself, well, now I quite want to make one of those. That kind of sounds like fun. This is exactly how you can go about that process, because there are a number of core ideas that when you boil it down to those essentials, you have something that's quite compelling and something that can be longer lasting than just the experience of making the box itself, simply because others are going to be doing it at the same time. First section here, we're going to look at how do we make that map. One of the biggest core components of making a vulnerable virtual machine is defining your kill chain before you actually make it. Simply because without having your roadmap, you don't really know where you're going to go with the box, and well, you can't really build it without that. First off, we need to define what are we going for with this. The why and the who of the box is going to define it ultimately, and you're looking at really two different approaches. You're looking at either a capture the flag approach, where it's going to be a screw you, I'm going to make this as hard as possible with a certain difficulty level in mind, or you're making it educational where you're trying to introduce a topic and potentially using everything that you've got in the box in order to create something that is going to be end-to-end, step-by-step, an educational experience. We'll go into this a little bit more with a couple examples, one of a capture the flag style box that I've made, and then another one of an educational style box, and we'll see how those can differ pretty heavily between the two. Quick warning for those two boxes, spoilers ahead, because, well, I need to walk you through how to do them, otherwise we're not really going to be able to break down how we made them in that instance. First one we're going to look at is called Ignite CTF. This is one that I originally made for TryHackMe. This will be up on VulnHub soon. I actually need to fix an unintentional Linux privilege escalation that's in the kernel version of this box. But you know what? We won't worry about that for now because everything else works perfectly on it, right? So as we dive into the box, the first thing that we're going to look at is the kill chain itself. The overall goal that we established from the onset is that we're making a capture the flag style box, so it needs to have some sort of system running on it that is going to have traditionally a user and a root flag that we're going to define the path between those 2 points. In this instance, we're going to go ahead and break down the exact path from enumeration to that root for this box. So starting off, we have enumeration of the box, which is going to start with mmap, something very typical. This is not designed to be a very hard box. It's not set behind multiple different steps in order to get the user flag off of this. So enumeration in this case is just simply running a scan against it and discovering what is running on it. For this box in particular, we do have a fuel content management system that further enumeration of this on VulnHub specifically will reveal that there is a remote code execution that's unauthenticated and can be run pretty easily with a little bit of modification. And then the root part, specifically taking that code, modifying it, because actually from the onset for this specific box, it will be set up for using burp to capture it in the intermediary step, and it's set up for not necessarily having a web shell from the get-go, but it's going to get you that remote code execution so that you can send commands to the terminal in that instance. So going through running that, you can get the user flag of the machine, and then we move on to the local enumeration. In this specific instance, we're going to be looking actually revisiting the web application itself and looking at the configuration files. So this is a prime example of password reuse in this case. So we can see that in the actual configuration, we can find the root database user password, and then we can find just through trial and error that, well, that's shared with the root user password. If you did enumeration enough in the first step, you can actually bypass the remote code execution because that config file is browsable from the web. So just a fun way that you can allow a more experienced user that does a little bit more work from the get-go to jump ahead in steps, and it's something worth considering when you're looking at these. Here we can see that core structure. So this is very, very similar to a traditional pen test. And that's one of the things you can look at when you're designing boxes, which we'll go a little bit more into in just a few slides. But here we can see that we have that initial reconnaissance, the actual breakdown of the system, enumerating what is on there, and then discovering our attack vector that we want to take in this specific instance. After that, we can see our foothold into the actual box with running that remote code execution exploit. And then from them, we can see our local enumeration. Following that, we can go through and do our privilege escalation. In this case, of course, that is discovering that there is a shared password, and then we have root. So a little bit of a chopped down kill chain, but it's something that's worth considering, especially because this can provide you not just a framework for a pen test, but also for having the framework for your box going in reverse. The second box we're going to take a look at is an educational box. This is actually a box by the same name of one that is on Hack the Box. Very, very similar, and the same core exploit is used in it. However, this, we can see that we have a little bit more value in this because everything is broken down into individual steps where we can actually gain value from every single part of the box rather than just the, okay, let's run Eternal Blue against it, and then we've got root. So our kill chain, pretty simple. We're looking at, this is actually made from when I worked with the Kirkwood Cyber Defense Club, that I wanted to have a very easy boot to root box that they could have an introduction to using Metasploit in this instance because it's very straightforward to use. And then also to go ahead and break down things like hashes and how do you go through and crack those after the fact, and how do you take the loot that you've gained to move to other parts of the system. So in this case, fairly simple kill chain. We're looking at recon in the actual box itself. So in this case, discovering that we can see SMB on the box and it's not firewalled off, and then running Eternal Blue against it itself. After that, we go ahead and go into our privilege escalation, which in this case, since we already do have the system control, it's unnecessary, but it does demonstrate the migration between a service with the specific goal of hijacking the LSAS service following that. Then we can go ahead and move into hash dump, which brings in that other idea of actually cracking the passwords. And in this case, one of the common threads that we see in box design is this should never take longer than 5 minutes. Typically, you also want to use a very common word list, so RockU is going to be your friend, or maybe Fast Track, or top 500 worst passwords, something simple like that. But then you can go ahead and funnel that into John or Hashcat, and then you've got a password. All passwords on this machine are actually crackable with that idea in mind, so you get that more satisfaction on the person that's doing it, so that they can go through and see that, look, these passwords are bad, you should feel bad, and now we've got all of them by going through this process of actually cracking. Following this, this is where the box can deviate a little bit from a traditional CTF where we have flags that are not necessarily in standard locations. So in this case, we have 3 flags that are planted on the system. One of them is on the root of the C drive, which represents having that elevated permission to actually interact with the root folder. Then you also have the administrator's desktop, and then also the system32 folder. So teaching users where that actual SAM file is kept at on the system. Following this, we actually go into defining and then hitting our target with the actual box design itself. And this is important, especially when considering both our target audience and then the certain tolerances that we get with designing that box. So one of the core ideas here is that depending on who you're making it for, you sort of set a narrow path or a wider path for people to wander on. If you have a really narrow path, you're typically making a capture the flag style box where, well, you want to force people along one path. You don't want to have them go off and find another escalation vector. This is something we're going to go ahead and revisit in a few slides as well, but you don't want to necessarily let people fall off that as well and get lost. You also have the idea that with making an educational type box, you don't want to have it where people get lost on the way. And that's often defined by the content that you introduce on the side. So making sure that you have the detail, maybe not necessarily in the box itself, but maybe the worksheets that you have with it, or the certain instructions that you're providing users in order to keep them focused rather than being frustrated and giving up on what you're doing. Now we're going to go ahead and revisit specifically the differences between having that capture the flag style box and then the educational style box. And one of the core ideas that comes to mind here is the tool set that we're looking at. With the CTF style box, we immediately go to exploit DB, so we're going to a little bit more advanced exploitation where there is that modification on the part of the user. That is something that if you gave that to maybe a high school student, they might kind of look at you and think, what the hell are you going to have me do? Where in the case of using Blue, that educational box, we go with Metasploit because, well, that's pretty easy and you can just tell them the commands to run and, well, they won't really get lost unless they typo some command. Additionally, we're looking again at the detail in the material that you're providing with it. Part of the idea here is narrowing that path accordingly, and this almost comes into the idea of how difficult do you want the box to be. So if it's more difficult, you can make the path wider and have a lot of pitfalls there. That's something you're typically going to see with maybe a medium to hard level box on Hack the Box. And then also being a Sherpa in this right. So if you have a box that you're making for an educational purpose, you need to be that guide. You need to go through it, run it yourself, and maybe walk through it with someone that has no experience in this, because otherwise you aren't going to know how they're going to get lost. And then last but not least, we have that expanded scope within the educational box. This is something you can also consider with the actual capture the flag style box, where you have the expanded scope of maybe multiple steps per privilege escalation. It's pretty common to have 2 to 3 steps, usually 1 to 2, depending on how evil you are in your box design. But you also have the idea within the educational box that every single step can be a new topic that you're introducing, and maybe a little bit of research on top of that topic to bring them into a new level of understanding. And it brings that idea of waste not, want not with everything that you have in the box. A couple design highlights as we go into this as well. You need to have your kill chain ready as you're designing it. So as we're looking through actually making the box, you need to have your treasure map built out for yourself before you do the installation. If you have your kill chain built out, it allows you to connect the dots as you're setting up the system, and it allows you to almost have a little bit more forgiveness with yourself as you're cleaning up things, because it's very easy to miss a small step and then, well, guess what? Someone just found the easiest way to get through your box, and it might be your password. Then having that right up first with that is going to help you a lot there too. Oftentimes, this is going to start with a normal installation, so keeping in mind you are going to go through and a lot of times let updates run unless specifically you're targeting a certain version of Windows. So maybe you want to get Blue Keep run against this, or maybe you want to have Eternal Blue. Doing a normal installation up until that point, the only real important consideration you want to have is your password, just because, again, you don't want to have your password be the least common denominator in your kill chain. You don't want to have it be what people go for first, just brute forcing your password to get root. And then again, working backwards from that hardest step. A lot of times what I see when making these boxes is you need to find the hardest step both for yourself and then for the people that are doing your box. A lot of times this can be your software installation, so sometimes it can be an FTP server that you screw up the installation because it doesn't quite work as you want for the privilege escalation. A good example is there was an FTP server that I was getting set up specifically the other day for a box that it gave you direct root access, and I didn't want that. I specifically wanted it to run under a user account, and while the FTP server just broke in that instance, which not a great design on that point, but then again, it was also vulnerable, so I mean, it's kind of my fault for using it at that point, but you can find that hardest part for you, and you don't want to go through all the other work of setting up the box and having everything perfect and then going through your software installation and screwing it all up. But again, you can also go through it from the other angle of the user, where you have their hardest step, which is often going to be the same for the installation part, and working backwards from that to connect the dots of the box itself. A couple more design highlights. So again, it's going to be managing your difficulty level. You need to have your target audience in mind, and this can be very hard when you're designing the box, specifically because, well, you know how it's done. When you're going back through an environment and you've already been through that environment before, you're very comfortable with it, and it can often be deceptively easy. Or you might think it's really hard, just depending on the experiences that you have. This is often where it's important to have someone else try it for you and watch them as they struggle, which not everyone's going to volunteer for that, but you're going to get a lot more insight into specifically the difficulty level that you might have in mind versus what everyone else sees. this is something where you can get some pushback on as well. So it's important to know that people are going to get upset with you and not want to try. So you have to filter out a little bit of the noise in that aspect. Research what you're going to be using. So in this case, it's finding those gotchas, finding kernel flaws, finding something that maybe the software needs to install in a specific location, but you don't want to have a user that can access that location running there. And that's often where you can introduce multiple steps to make it more complex or remove, sort of have an extra layer of extraction between the actual entry point or the priv escalation and the actual completion of the box. So something to be aware of. It's often something that will go and bite you in the butt a couple times as you release boxes, just because you can't get everything, and most of the time you will miss something, and someone's going to come back and say, well, I just did this in 5 minutes because of that. And then last but not least, one of the items that a lot of people miss with releasing boxes, and this is very common in VulnHub, but keeping the box current. So even after you've released it, maintaining that box and making sure that the path that is possible to do that box is the same as you've intended. So even if someone finds one of those gotchas and beats you to getting everything done or finds an easier way to do it, going back and fixing that. Something you can absolutely do, and it's usually pretty easy just to swap out the file that's up on VulnHub. Next, we have putting it all together. So getting into this, we'll talk a little bit about the tools very quickly, since most of us are probably familiar with them, and then the finishing touches that we want to put on the box. So tools of the trade, this is mostly put in there for beginners. It might not have experience with hypervisors, but using ESXi, VirtualBox, or VMware Workstation or Player. Usually it's much easier to offload the work of the actual machine onto a blade. That's mainly for testing purposes, because then you can have your Kali machine that's running on the same network to actually test the box. Oftentimes, depending on the box that you're making, if it's a Windows server, it can be pretty fat, and that's pretty hard on a normal laptop. And then additionally, looking at ExploitDB, it almost gets into the point where you can go through and shop for exploits on that and look for things that have downloadable application files for vulnerable items on there. So looking for that downloadable file and designing around that. And then just finishing up the box here. So these are a couple pitfalls that a lot of people see when making the box. So again, it comes back to the idea of tolerances. If you're having a CTF style box, you are essentially introducing a very fast marble into a small maze. Someone's going to find a way out, and it might be through the maze normally, or they're just going to knock a hole in the wall. So finding that path of least resistance. And then looking at the educational side of things, if you have a more guided instance, you don't have to fix everything. Because if the material's there, people are going to stick to the material for the most part, as long as it is easy to understand and you don't necessarily have a lot of logical jumps between the point A to point B. And then a couple points. These are more so just things to consider as you're finishing up the box. Linking your history to DevNull, making sure that no one can go back through as they get to an account and figure out how well you built the box, because usually it's a lot easier to figure out how to get from user to root if they can see how you made it. Then removing the fluff. If you don't need something on the box, if you don't need, if you want to be evil and remove nano and force people to use Vim, you can go ahead and do that. But making sure that you don't have anything on there that is going to become another item that you have to maintain. Patching the rest, anything else that's on there you need to maintain. That's just consideration of making sure that you don't introduce more into the box than what you want. Avoiding password escalation, so don't make your password the path of least resistance. Don't reuse passwords that you use other places, because people will find it and they will use it and you won't be in a bad spot. And then last but not least, putting in a couple Easter eggs. This is something that a lot of people can overlook when they put boxes together, but it's usually pretty fun to go through and add something small, maybe add a quote in there somewhere. Then polishing up, going into testing, making sure that it works. You should run it at least twice and try to do it incorrectly the second time. Converting to OVA, just because that's what most people, or most places will take. VulnHub specifically will take this, and same thing with Hack the Box. And then upload and release. Any questions?
Is it possible to make money doing this?
Absolutely.
We should have started with that.
I know. I know.
Do it all again.
So some places will actually pay for custom material to be created. It's very common to see groups that do, maybe even a group like this, where you'd have a box created for a specific night, or maybe for B-sides that someone wants a specific box with a very specific exploit. It's not necessarily easy to go through and do this, especially because of the number of gotchas that you can have. I know specifically TryHackMe will pay for box creators every once in a while to have curated equipment, or curated boxes made. Any other questions? And you're right, I probably should have started with that.
How long does it take you on average to build a box?
It depends. A lot of times I will go through and I have just note files filled with partial kill chains that I don't necessarily like the point A to point B. So I will make a good example is one that I've been working on for a little while, which again has that FTP server on. Actually, we'll go with a different example. So maybe having an evil game server that's running on a system. So maybe you have a Minecraft server that's installed on a system and you want to make it vulnerable by introducing maybe a malicious plugin. So maybe make it so that they have to connect to the server and run some malicious command in it, but not necessarily having an endpoint to that. So you can have a lot of those put together and it can make the making process pretty quick. Typically, if I'm sitting down and just finding whatever I can grab on ExploitDB, this can take like an hour, and the longest part is the installation. It just depends. This is a practice-heavy item, so like everything in InfoSec, the more you practice it, the easier it's going to become, especially if you have a script written out that's going to do a lot of the dev null linking and things like that for you. Go ahead.
How long does an entry-level virtual machine, one of these VMs, take to go through that participant?
Typically, I would aim at, if you want to have it straightforward and you want to have it guided, I would aim for half an hour. That's usually a pretty good metric. It depends, again, on your setting, because you need to plan for at least double the time for questions because people are going to get lost, especially when you're introducing new concepts. I know for the Kirkwood CDC, introducing cracking was something that took a little bit to get into and understand specifically how Hashcat runs against these things. So, go ahead.
Now that you spend so much time building them, do you still have fun playing them, or is
Oh, yeah.
sausage been made?
So this is one of the things that it helps to be on both sides of the fence for both doing and then making these. Going through and having done a bunch helps you have a greater understanding of how to go through and create them, specifically because you know what you're going to be looking for. You get used to some of the privilege escalation chains that you can have. So maybe having a sudo that's incorrectly configured or something simple like that, or having something more complex like there was a recent box that came out that you could run malicious code by putting extra code in the running program itself. So you would be able to interact with it by launching the program as another user and then breaking out of it with the shell. So getting used to things like that.
What percentage of boxes, let me rephrase that, what percentage of players on a box you've created go about solving it in a non-conventional way, or a way that you didn't design it?
I would say most people, actually. It depends on how clear it is, because if you make it something that you don't have to go through multiple hoops to get to. So, for example, if you have a good example is actually one that just got retired from Hack the Box, Ghoul. There was an initial step with finding Zipslip. And finding that had a number of additional things in front of it. So Zipslip, for those who are not familiar, is a flaw in the zip protocol where you could put backticks, so directory traversal into it, and then you'd be able to overwrite things like, I don't know, maybe the SSH keys or something silly like that. So, simple things like that. But going through and having an extra level in front of that where you have to do maybe directory enumeration, maybe you have to find a password in an FTP share, you can go through and make the path as long as you want. And depending on how long that path ends up being, it can impact dramatically how people go about the box. So you're going to have your simplest things found first, typically. So if you go through and add a bunch of really simple pitfalls, like maybe have VSFTP, where a lot of people will think that, oh, I found it, it's a back door that's in there, and usually it's not. You have things like that your less experienced players will go ahead and try going down those paths first, and maybe you accidentally did install the version with the backdoor. Well, you're hosed at that point. But it's how much you have sitting in front of it. The simpler the box is, so for example, Blue, since it only has really one thing and it doesn't have RDP on, so you can't have Blue Keep attempted in this specific instance, that's pretty simple, because if you run an nmap script vuln scan, That's all it's going to find. Any that box is a mess. We don't talk about it. If you run local privilege escalation on Blue specifically, because it is a clean install Windows 7, well, clean, I went into the services panel with a sledgehammer. If you run it on it, the firewall's off, you can do whatever you want to that box. It just doesn't care. You already have system authority by the time you are touching it.
So, as a creator of challenges, are you allowed to like build up a reputation for yourself so like people get to know you?
Absolutely.
How does that work?
We have, actually with Try Hack Me, one of the people that works with us is one of the main content creators for VulnHub. His name is Zayatic, that he goes through and builds things like Jigsaw. He'll make, there's a number of Greek boxes that he's made. Very, very influential creator that he'll go through, and he has a Twitter following because of that. So it is something that you can go through and gain a substantial following if people really like your boxes and really like your work.
So you're saying I can get money and fame?
Pretty much. Yeah. And that's actually commonly what people will do on Hack the Box is you don't necessarily get paid for your work on Hack the Box, but you can go through and have it before a huge audience. So. Any other questions? Perfect. Well, thank you guys for coming.